Remarkable year for politics.
Oh, that was amazing as usual, Payne. So Payne has some business cards here. If you want to support Payne's work, you can hire him to do events. You can also support him on Patreon. I encourage you, where can they find you on other social media?
I have a website, thepoetpayne.com, Payne with the E at the end. On Instagram at Payne the Poet, Payne with the E at the end. All that information is up there on the cards. So Payne the Poet. Look me up.
And please come take a photo of one of his business cards before you leave. Thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting us tonight, and for Payne for coming up from Norfolk to be with us. And I always just so inspired when I hear what Payne does. And one of the themes of the book, if you actually get it and read it, is how are we going to change this narrative that has produced a legal culture and a society more generally that has allowed for the massive caging of human beings, and all of the cruelty that's entailed in that bureaucratic process that leads us to inflict so much pain. So I want to talk for a little bit about sort of my perspective on things. Actually, there's some room over here if people who are in the back want to just like come filter in. It might be a little bit easier. And I think they have a couple more chairs for anyone who would be more comfortable in a chair. Is that right, Jonathan? Jonathan, do we have a couple more chairs for some? And there's another empty chair right here. So I was going to talk for just a few minutes about my perspective, some of the background, how we got into some of the work that we're doing. I'd mostly then like to have questions and comments from the audience. I find that these events are much better with someone not just talking at people, but for a real discussion. The only thing I would ask is that if you do ask a question, maybe you can say your name, or if you make a comment, say your name so that I or other people can refer back to your comment and your awesome thoughts as we build a discussion together. So I first started doing this kind of work when I quit being a public defender in 2014. I had gotten a grant from my law school to, I think I pitched the grant as something to the effect of, give me some money so I can take down and dismantle the criminal legal system. And the people that I pitched this to were, this is a wild idea. There's no way we're ever giving you this money. That you have no hope of accomplishing something so broad, and it just sounds ridiculous. Luckily for me, nobody else applied for the money. And so they ended up having to give it to me. And the first thing I did with their money was I bought a plane ticket to Alabama, where I used to be a public defender. And the plan was to just sort of go from court to court and city to city and jail to jail and see what I found. That trip really changed the course of my life and my career. I remember toward the end of the trip, I was going to stop in Montgomery and visit some of my old colleagues. And before I went into their office Monday morning, I stopped into the local courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama. And that morning, there were 67 people in jail garb and chains around their ankles and waists and wrists. All of them were black. And as I watched the court hearing, it became clear to me that not a single one of them was charged with a crime. Also, what was really fascinating was there was a prosecutor, but no public defender. And there was a man arguing that this person should be jailed and this person should be jailed, and they didn't pay enough money and they should be jailed. And one by one, the people whose lives were being discussed would get up in front of the judge and beg for mercy. They would say things like, Your Honor, I have 4 children. 2 of them are disabled. Please don't lock me up. I don't know what to do. Don't take me away from my kids. Another man got down kneeling on the floor of the courtroom and begged for mercy. He said, I've done bad things in my life. I was addicted to drugs. I've stolen things. I can't afford these tickets. Please don't put me in jail. And for each one, the judge said, unless you pay me $1,000 or $2,000, I'm throwing you in jail. I later learned, actually, I'm a pretty sophisticated court observer. I'm a lawyer. I later learned, as I was sitting there, that the person I thought was the prosecutor was actually the public defender. And it turned out that the city of Montgomery's contract for public defense told this man that he wouldn't be paid unless enough money was collected through fees and fines, and sort of explained what I was watching. When I found that out, I did what seemed natural to me, and I started making objections. In Alabama, you're not permitted to make objections while you're sitting in the courtroom audience, especially if you're not barred in Alabama. I was asked to leave the courtroom, and I had seen about 5 cases by that point, and I'd written down their names. And I walked up into the local jail, which in Montgomery, Alabama is both physically and metaphorically, as it is in so many of our communities around the country, the jail is connected to the courthouse. And I walked in and I called those 5 names, and they brought me those 5 people. Again, after 5 people, they figured out what I was doing, and I was asked to leave the jail as well. But those 5 people became my first clients as a civil rights lawyer. I'll just very briefly talk about 2 of them, because I think it bears on why I wrote the book. The first person who I opened the first essay in the book about is Charnel Mitchell. And Charnel had been sitting on her couch with her 1-year-old on her lap and her 4-year-old next to her. And police raided her home, and they arrested her and ripped her away from her kids because she owed traffic tickets from 2010, 4 years prior. She'd been in jail for 2 weeks by the time I met her, and she had no idea where her babies were. She was desperate to get back to them. A jail guard was nice enough to give her a pencil. She had showed me her court document. It said, pay us $2,807 or do 58 days in jail. On the back of that court document, she had been writing numbers, 2,807, the amount she owed on the top right. On the left-hand column, she'd written the days, 1 through 58. She was writing 50, 75, 75, 50, 75, and then on the right-hand side, she was subtracting those numbers from 2,807. I asked her what she was doing, and she said, well, in Montgomery, you get $50 a day toward your debt just for being in the jail. But if you agree to be a janitor for the city and to clean the feces and the blood and the mucus and the mold off of the jailhouse floors where you sleep and the walls, and if you agree to clean the judge's trash cans, you get an extra $25 a day. So all of the women in her pod were competing each day for who was going to get the $75 that day. And so some of the days she was able to do the extra work, and some of the days she wasn't. And so it became clear that Montgomery was running this sort of debtor's prison peonage system. And by the time she was done describing this to me and asking me if I could try to help her figure out where her kids were, the pencil on the back of the page was smeared with her tears. And I took a photograph of that document. The next person I met, Lorenzo Brown, was actually the man who had knelt down on his knees in court. He had to pay $2,000 or do 40 days in jail. Lorenzo wouldn't speak to me. He didn't trust me. I was wearing an inside-out hooded sweatshirt, and I told him I was a lawyer. And of course, the last person who he was told was his lawyer was the person that told the judge to lock him up. But he said, I'll speak to you on one condition, if my pastor gives me permission. So luckily, I had brought my phone into the jail, which might have been why I was asked to leave, I'm not sure. And we called his pastor on speakerphone. And his pastor said, luckily, my grant had just been posted online, so the pastor could Google that I was actually a lawyer. And he said, this lawyer is an angel from God sent to help you through this. And I said, actually, no, that's just not true at all. I'm not even barred here. But I would love to talk to you about this and see what we can do to help. And I then built this wonderful relationship with Lorenzo, a relationship of trust. And he told me his story that day, and subsequently, and Lorenzo and Charnel and 3 other people became my first clients. And within a few weeks, we were in a beautiful federal courtroom full of marble and wood, and Lorenzo and Charnel told their stories, and they told them beautifully. And the federal judge was so outraged at what had happened that he ordered all of the city officials to appear in front of him in person to explain how this could be happening. Instead of appearing in court, they just released everybody from their jail in a single day. And I think two things are really notable about that hearing. First, we as a culture and a legal system have become so desensitized to the brutality inherent in putting a human being in a cage that entire cities can have jails full of people for no reason at all. So little reason that on a single day, without any care in the world, they can release everybody. The second thing was something that happened that I didn't actually even see myself. I was going up to talk to the judge after the judge issued the ruling, and Lorenzo was walking with his cane toward the back of the courtroom, and there was a lawyer who had come to watch the hearing from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And she held the door open for him, and as he exited the threshold of the courtroom, he whispered to himself under his breath with his head down. He said, wow, I never knew I had this much power. And so the second thing that I learned that day, I think, was the power of these narratives, particularly when they're told by people who've been directly impacted by this system. And I think a lot of the people in whose name our legal system functions every single day don't have any idea the kind of pain and cruelty that it's inflicting on people's bodies and minds and families and communities. And so after the Montgomery case, I went to Ferguson. Michael Brown had just been murdered. It's actually where I met Joe Shapiro. We spent a lot of time together in Ferguson in 2014, and the same thing was going on in Ferguson. In fact, when I got there, the city of Ferguson averaged 3.6 arrest warrants per household, almost all of them for unpaid debt. So that's 2.2 arrest warrants for every adult in the city of Ferguson. We brought the same kind of case in Ferguson. We brought the same kind of case in Mississippi and in Louisiana and New Orleans. And as we're doing that work, it became really clear that this problem, this everyday infliction of brutality, the use of courts as mechanisms of revenue generation was ubiquitous all over the country. Another thing was clear as we kept winning these cases, judges kept saying it's unconstitutional to put a human being in a cage just because she can't make a monetary payment. But I realized at the time that was the very foundation of the American money bail system. So at the time we were bringing and winning these cases for people who'd been convicted and couldn't afford to pay their fines and fees, there were 500,000 human beings in jail cells every single night prior to being convicted of anything at all because they couldn't make a monetary payment. And I know a lot of you know about this issue at this point. In fact, I see Judge Morrison in the back who's worked on this issue for how many years, Judge? 40? You're not that old, 20 years. And so we began a series of cases designed to challenge the American money bail system. And in the first 10 months of 2015, we filed 12 of these cases in 12 different cities. The goal was twofold, really, to show that it could be done, to articulate this very basic legal theory that no human being should be caged because she can't make a payment, and also to create a sense of urgency and momentum, a sense of urgency that really, I think, was lacking in the way our legal system confronted the issue of mass human caging. The other goal was to work, not just as lawyers, to come up with some theory and then articulate it in the courts and have the courts solve the problem and then go home, but to work with communities to tell certain stories in a different way, to build power in those communities so that if we did win a case, the people who decided what would replace this illegal system weren't the same people that created it. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons that I wrote this book. 5-6 years later, there's a lot more attention on this horrible injustice that is our criminal punishment bureaucracy. But I'm very scared about the state of what's called the criminal justice reform movement. I think it's out there in the ether now, but has anyone ever heard the phrase, the criminal justice system is broken? Yep. It's kind of a popular thing to say now. And one thing I've realized as we've gone around the country doing this work is that your theory for what's wrong with the criminal punishment system really informs the kind of strategies and tactics you might use to fix it. If you think that the criminal justice system is trying to create a society where all human beings can flourish and everyone is equal, then yes, it's quite broken. But if you think that its purpose is something different, to control and cage and surveil and preserve certain hierarchies of power and distributions of wealth in our society, it's actually functioning quite well. And if you see it in that perspective, it's an incredibly efficient bureaucracy, a bureaucracy that somehow manages to take 12 million people every single year from their schools and churches and homes and families and jobs and houses and puts them into this entire sort of system of government-run cages of concrete and metal. And where I come down after 11 years of being a lawyer is that the system is functioning quite well. And its stated purposes, the purposes that it's telling us every single day, are not its actual functions in our society. And if you think that, you're going to have a different philosophy for the kinds of interventions we need to make. If you think that the people that are running the punishment bureaucracy are in good faith, just trying to make us all have flourishing lives and live better, you might think that the solution is to just give them some more information and more data. Show them that actually we've spent trillions of dollars on this, we've caged tens of millions of people, and yet, let's just take the war on drugs, the example that I talk about a little bit in the book. Drug usage rates are higher than they were before. We've captured everyone's electronic communications, we've ended privacy as we know it, we've caged people, we've ruined their families, we've separated hundreds of thousands of children from their families in every single American state, and yet we have nothing to show for it. Maybe people are that dumb and you could just show them these statistics and they would just, oh my goodness, like how can what can we do to fix this? Let's just end police. Let's get rid of police. Let's get rid of courts. Let's get rid of jails, right? That's not what they're going to do, right? If you think that the criminal punishment bureaucracy is actually a locus where power is contesting power, and that the ruling class uses the criminal punishment bureaucracy to control certain aspects of our population and to preserve hierarchies of wealth and power, then your solutions are much more likely to be organizing people who are directly impacted by the system, building powerful forces that can contest that power at the level of real power. That is sort of the philosophy of civil rights core, the argument that I make in the book. The argument is that if you're working in the criminal justice reform space, anything that you do that metastasizes and grows the bureaucracy rather than dismantles it, that doesn't actually focus on building power among people who are directly impacted, is not in the end going to make any bit of difference in the system. And let me just give, before hopefully someone will interrupt me with a question or a comment, the example of bail reform, I think, is maybe one of the most powerful examples of this phenomenon, and one of the main reasons that I wrote the book, to try to explain why I think this is so dangerous. There was a bail reform movement. It was led by fancy lawyers, mostly white men, called themselves liberal, 1960s. It was a cause taken up very poignantly by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Before he was assassinated. These people led this first bail reform movement. And they said, it's unconstitutional and wrong and immoral to cage people because they can't make a payment. And after years of advocacy within the bureaucracy itself, they were successful, and they passed the Federal Bail Reform Act of 1984. The day before that act went into effect, 24% of all people charged with federal crimes were detained just because they couldn't make a monetary payment. So it's a big problem. A quarter of all people charged with federal crimes, presumptively innocent, were in a jail cell prior to trial, away from their families, just because they couldn't pay. Today, as I stand here, talking to you all, 72.4% of federal criminal pretrial defendants are detained. So we got rid of the injustice of cash bail and wealth-based detention, and we tripled the rate of pretrial detention. And we increased the percentage of impoverished people and people of color who are arrested. So we actually are caging 3 times more people, and it's more racially discriminatory and more discriminatory from a socioeconomic class perspective than it was before. And I think the answer sort of to this sort of, potential paradox lies in the fact that those reforms are led by elites, by people who control the punishment bureaucracy. It wasn't any kind of change in the underlying power dynamics that created the criminal punishment bureaucracy that the ruling class uses to control certain populations. And I think back over the history of the American judiciary, what made us think that institutions like the courts and Congress were ever going to be the source of radical social justice? If you look back at the Supreme Court's history, it's never been a source of radical social change. That's not what judges are. Judges don't see themselves as radical agents of social change. They see themselves as agents of stability, preserving order. That's why at every single turn, whether it's on racial justice issues or gender justice issues or economic justice issues, the Supreme Court has always lagged behind social movements. And the same is true when you look at the criminal legal punishment bureaucracy. Even the case that is perhaps considered the most significant and positive case in the history of the American Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education, I think provides an example. You can have this beautiful decree in Brown that it's unconstitutional to segregate schools, and yet 5 years after Brown, 20 years after Brown, 40 years after Brown, 60 years after Brown, you can have more school segregation in many parts of the country than before Brown. Maybe a corollary, one that maybe we can draw something from, is the same-sex marriage movement. Some very smart lawyers brought cases in the late 70s and early 80s about the right for same-sex marriage. They were basically lost in every court they were in, including the US Supreme Court. 20, 25, 30 years later, some of the same lawyers, but other very fancy, smart lawyers, using the same 6 or 7 words in the 14th Amendment, brought the same set of cases. This time they won in virtually every court, including the United States Supreme Court. Now, it wasn't that those lawyers were smarter or that the 14th Amendment became better. I think what happened was that there was a social movement in this country that changed the way people think about same-sex marriage. Now, I know there's a lot of disagreement about how that social movement was organized and potentially co-opted by certain moderate interests, but the point is that there was a social movement and that's what the court responded to. And what I think we need in this context is a radical social movement that changes the way we think about human caging, that changes the way we think about the criminal punishment bureaucracy as a tool of oppression, and that changes the way all of us understand that this system's purpose is to be the locus where power is exerted over people's bodies. It is the reason that if my ancestors stole certain land from other people, that today I can call the cops if someone tries to trespass on that land and exert the force and violence of the state to remove them from my property. At its core, that is what the criminal punishment is all about. It's all about preserving certain hierarchies of wealth and power. That's the argument that I make in the book. And I think what's so scary is that many of the people that are parading around the country as criminal justice reformers, some of them quite famous people who are running for president, some of them are former attorney generals, they are making a claim that all we need to do is make a few tweaks. You know, we need to have slightly shorter mandatory minimum sentences and maybe some more diversion programs. And you know what would be great if we could spend several $100 million in every major American city and put body cameras on the police to watch them oppress the same people in the same neighborhoods doing the same things. Those are the kinds of things that typically sort of pass for reforms in our current criminal punishment bureaucracy reform movement, which is often called the justice reform movement. And so I wrote the book in a way to try to, as an intellectual matter, to scrutinize some of those claims and to offer a set of rules of thumb so that people could tell what is a good reform versus a bad reform, what is likely to help dismantle the system and build power, what is likely to reify it and reinforce all of the sort of aspects of the criminal punishment bureaucracy that are causing all of these problems. And I don't think if we don't confront those questions, I worry that this movement will be co-opted and that people who have profited off of and created the criminal punishment bureaucracy are going to shave off some of its most grotesque flourishes, but leave in place all of the architecture and bureaucracy of this apparatus that we've created. I'm going to stop there just for a second because I've been talking for a long time, more than I intended. And several people have heard this book talk a couple of times, so they've learned virtually nothing from what I've said, but thank you, friends, for coming again. I want to make sure that this is most useful and relevant for the people that are here. So if there are questions or comments and I think Jonathan has a microphone, right? So we can pass it around so someone hopefully will be brave enough to ask the first question, then it usually gets going. Yes? Hello.
Cash bail system been privatized the way the prison system has? And if so, what is the role of the private sector in retaining the status quo?
Right, so Sarah asked, old family friend here, thank you for asking the first question. The cash bail system, has it been privatized in the same way that some of the prison system has been privatized? The answer is yes. So throughout the long history of the use of money bail, basically since the Magna Carta, for-profit bail bonding had been illegal in England. It still is illegal in England. In about 1898, the U.S. sort of saw its first for-profit commercial surety company start working in San Francisco. And to this day, for-profit money bail is only legal in the United States and the Philippines. And that industry has really corrupted the basic delivery of what is called pretrial justice. Again, I don't use these terms like the Department of Justice or pretrial justice or the criminal justice system. Those are terms of propaganda that give you the impression that what they're trying to do and what they're actually doing is some kind of justice. Similarly, the term law enforcement is meant to imply that there's some kind of objectivity in the enforcement of the laws, not just like enforcing some laws against some people. But we call this system the pretrial justice system. It's been privatized in almost every American state. So 46 states have private for-profit money bail industry. What's fascinating is we've actually been able to have significant victories in many of these states, including, for example, after we won a constitutional case striking down the money bail system as we know it in California, the Democratic California legislature passed a bill eradicating the for-profit money bail industry in California. What's so scary about that is that those industries aren't stupid, and the punishment bureaucrats who supported that repeal of the cash bail industry basically aren't stupid. They carefully fashioned a system that would replace it. And we're seeing this all over the country. I mentioned the Federal Bail Reform Act where we increased pretrial detention. What we're seeing in all these places like California, when they passed the Cash Bail Reform Act, they actually included some provisions that expand their ability dramatically to increase pretrial detention. So they passed a bill that is going to get rid of the cash bail industry and is forecast by all of the counties in California to dramatically increase their jail populations. They used, because we hadn't built enough power and because we weren't striking at the core of the reasons that California had been relying on the cash bail system, namely to funnel people through and coerce their guilty pleas really quickly so the bureaucracy could keep moving, we ended up with a law that was passed that would actually dramatically increase pretrial detention. Now, the bail industry, to get back to your privatization question, also wasn't that concerned in a lot of respects about the reforms that are being proposed all over the country. And that's because the private prison industry, the private supervision industry, and the bail industry see the writing on the wall. They see the public sort of zeitgeist is against cash bail right now. So what are they doing? they're reallocating their capital and their business model. Instead of being the person that sells you the bail bond, now you're going to be released without cash bond, but ordered to some kind of supervision. They're going to be the person that charges you for the GPS monitor, and they're going to be the person that charges you for the drug test, and they're going to be the for-profit pretrial services officer that you have to report to every week. And so they're going to be making the same amount of money off the same populations with a different label. And this right there is, I think, a fantastic example of if you don't confront these mechanisms of oppression at the level of real power, they will just reproduce themselves with a different label. And so I think the fact that we're taking head on the privatization of the cash bail industry, certainly there's a lot of, they haven't given up, and they are, I don't want to make it seem like they are fighting us very hard in all these places, but they all understand, and some of the larger aggregations of wealth that back them from like a investment perspective and from the, sort of the large insurance companies that control them, they all understand very well that they have another ready-made business model right there. Because there's 2.3 million human beings in cages right now in this country, but there's another 5 million people on some kind of government-run supervision. And those people are very easy to make money off of. Another question? Yeah. Casey.
Yes. My question is, do you think, because you were a former public defender and then you left and you're no longer a public defender, do you think it's possible to be a public defender and also not be a cog in this system of the bureaucratization of the criminal justice system?
Let me preface my answer by saying I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if it's possible to be a lawyer in our society without being complicit in this great injustice. Before I talk about public defenders and say some maybe negative things, because I know there's so many former public defenders in the room, let me say that it's not clear at all that the work that we're engaged in now, where we're going to federal courts and asking those courts to vindicate certain constitutional rights, it's not clear that that work isn't also just sort of legitimating this system and maybe lending it the credibility that it needs to keep functioning. So it's something that I struggle with every single night as I go to sleep. What is the line between using the system and the cases that we're able to bring in the system as maybe a way of helping communities in local organizing campaigns, helping people create a moment and a vehicle for telling a certain story? Because I definitely believe that the story that we're telling in a lot of our cases is subversive or has the potential to be subversive, in the sense that I think everyone understands very viscerally, for example, just sticking with the bail example, although we do other work, it's ridiculous to keep a human being in a cage because she can't make a payment, and cruel and senseless. It makes no sense. And I think a lot of people are saying, well, if the criminal justice system is doing that, and doing that to 500,000 human beings every single day and separating families, what else is it doing? If I can't trust that, how do I trust all of the other things that it's telling me about what it's doing? Right? So I think there's something subversive in the local and national narratives that we're able to tell around it. But nonetheless, you're still left every single night with the feeling that you're participating in this unjust system, and that it's very difficult to ever find a progressive, radical social movement that's done real damage to our country's ruling class that's been led by lawyers. And when I say, I mean lawyers qua lawyers. Like, I think lawyers, just like other people, can participate in social movements and can be part of building power, but whenever lawyers get involved in something, they seem to want to control it and make decisions, and I think it's hard to think of an example where that's actually led to radical social change. Now I've been avoiding this real crux of your question for a long time. I ended up leaving being a public defender because I concluded that I was complicit in the system and wasn't able to push and prod and challenge and expose it as effectively as I might be able to do if I was a little bit more free. Another thing that had to do with it was I'm very bad with bosses. And so maybe it's possible for a different person to have been a public defender and to have done the things I wanted to do, but I was either going to get fired or leave, so I had to leave first. But all kidding aside, I want to say two things about public defenders. There's no question that we've been complicit in this system. And I know that there's all kinds of constraints that are placed on public defenders, incredible crushing caseloads, horrific judiciary. I mean, judges are really the problem. I know there's some judges here. They are the biggest obstacle to change in every jurisdiction that we go to. Prosecutors, I know the constraints, but we've been complicit too. I worked for two of the most prestigious public defender organizations in the country, the Federal Public Defender's Office and the Public Defender Service here in the District of Columbia. In my 4.5 years at both those offices, neither I, and it's something I have to live with every day, nor anyone else from my office, to my knowledge, filed a single bail appeal, a single appeal of pretrial detention issue. I know for a fact that we didn't file a single request for bond pending appeal my entire time at the Federal Defender's Office, and I'm not sure if we filed one at the Public Defender Service either. Routinely, now think about what that means. When I got to PDS, our appellate division was winning about 33% of its cases. However, because of the backlog of cases and the time it took to process them, it took about 3.5 years for a case on average to get done. And so if your sentence was less than 3.5 years, you'd already served your sentence by the time you won your case a third of the time. And in that context, it was in that context that we weren't asking for our clients to be released pending appeal. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on the lawyers who work there, because I and other people who work there often had good reasons for not filing certain motions, but to never file any, right? And what does it say to a legal system? Like when I was in the Federal Defender's Office, I was told when I wanted to file a bail appeal, we just don't do that, right? What does it say to the other actors in the courtroom that the person who's supposed to tell this client's story and who's supposed to take her human caging as a matter of the most extreme urgency, that any wealthy person would have a lawyer filing an appeal immediately? What does it say to everyone involved that we're not doing it? They must be thinking, the most charitable read of it is they have good reasons for it. It must not be that bad in jail. Maybe they don't want to. Maybe there's some other reason the lawyer doesn't want to do it, right? It leads to all this kind of thinking, and the aggregate of that thinking, if you're a judge or a probation officer or a prosecutor or public defender, over the course of tens, hundreds, thousands of cases, right, is to sort of lose sense and to stop even asking your clients, what does it mean when you're incarcerated? What will it mean for you if you're detained for the next 2 months until your trial? What will it mean for you if you're detained until your appeal? And since you're not even asking those questions of your client, you're of course not telling that story in court, and a whole set of narratives that would be so important to changing the way our legal system thinks are just being ignored. And so I think the second thing I wanted to say about public defenders is I think that's changing. I spend a lot of time now with public defenders all over the country, working with them, training them, collaborating. I just did a conference in New York about this exact issue, and the question that public defenders are now struggling with, and I think it's really beautiful to watch, is how can public defenders be a part of a social movement? How can public defenders be in a position to act collectively, to organize around certain issues, to refuse to participate in certain aspects of the system, to, where possible, organize with their clients? Now, one barrier to this has been the rules of ethics, which are written by corporate lawyers, typically for the benefit of corporate clients, and enforced by an apparatus that is mostly prosecutorial and judicial. But it's long been told to public defenders that you can't, do anything collectively with your clients because it's against the interests of individual clients. It's fascinating to watch public defenders like push and prod at the margins of that and maybe untangle some of those threads. But they're also doing really creative things like keeping track of prosecutorial misconduct in databases, right? Organizing it, collecting it. They're working now with journalists. When I was a public defender, we were forbidden from ever speaking to a journalist. Now, there's a new moment where we're thinking, how can we actually take back the narrative in our society about what the criminal punishment bureaucracy is? We are in an amazing position to work with our clients and tell their stories. So it's actually kind of an exciting time to be in public defense world. I think they're starting to, in many communities, work with community organizers. Some public defenders are hiring community organizers. There's a totally different moment in many of these jurisdictions, and I think it's possible now to do some of the things that weren't possible 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And in addition, it's an incredibly noble job, just on a daily basis. Standing there next to someone who our society wants to put in a cage and telling their story and standing between that person and a cage. So I never tell people not to be a public defender. But I do think we need to understand the ways in which even public defenders have become desensitized to the brutality that the system is inflicting every single day. I hope that is enough, but we can talk more afterwards. Yeah. I don't want to get in too much trouble, so.
Hi, my name is Ben Phillips. I'm a 1L at Georgetown. In the kind of mainstream criminal justice reform movement, we hear a lot about these kind of unlikely coalitions of, social justice progressives, conservatives who want small government. It's an ineffective use of resources, So one, do you think that there's any merit to these kinds of coalitions? And then two, in the more grassroots and radical work that you're doing, are there similar coalitions unlikely or otherwise?
Great question. So I think there's a real, it's very difficult to know what the effect of some of the sort of bipartisan criminal justice reform efforts are. Some of them seem real to me in the sense that they're actually meaningfully getting people out of prison and jail and changing practices and actually exploiting things like libertarian philosophy and religious sort of philosophy to actually change the way people think about punishment and to undermine the punishment bureaucracy. Other efforts seem mostly like ploys to like reinforce the punishment bureaucracy, and it can sometimes take a trained eye to figure out what's what. So I think at the end of the day, we have to be very, very careful with the kinds of coalitions that you're talking about. Make no mistake, most of the sort of conservative criminal justice reformers, they may have been persuaded somewhere along the way that, especially if they're libertarian, that the criminal legal system is out of control and completely ineffective for its stated aims and something to be really reckoned with. But at the end of the day, most Democrats and Republicans, so this applies to mainstream Democrats and sort of more standard libertarians and Republicans, most of those people are fairly happy with how our society looks. So if, for example, there was a choice between radically dismantling and abolishing the criminal punishment system and like keeping our society mostly the way it looks, they're going to choose the latter every single time. And so if your theory is that we actually need a radically more just society that looks really, really different from it in terms of like who owns things and you know, then I worry that those people are going to jump off the bandwagon. And so you have to think like, if, for example, you conclude that the best thing that you can do to fix the criminal punishment bureaucracy is universal health care and housing for all, just for example, if that's what your conclusion is, which I think would be by far the best thing we could do like right away for the criminal punishment bureaucracy, most of those people aren't going to be on board with that. I've found that most of the mainstream Democrats and conservatives that are in this movement want to think of criminal justice reform in a silo. They want to say, oh, we can make a little tweaks to the rules here on bail and to the rules there on sentencing, and yes, that'll be enough. Whereas the more radical people that you know, have a different philosophy of what the system's purpose is say, no, like the reason the criminal punishment system looks the way that it does is because of capitalism and white supremacy. Unless we attack those things at a real level and organize people and build relationships in communities, then we have no hope of actually, you know, fundamentally dismantling that system. I worry that some of the bipartisan work that's being done doesn't have a theory for grappling with that. But a lot of that work is the work that's actually getting a lot of people out of cages. And so there's this constant tension in our movement between harm reduction and fundamental change. And I think there's a lot of people that are doing that coalition work that are actually banking on also being smarter than the people that they're in coalition with, right? So understanding that like the system can be ratcheted up, and it was ratcheted up, but if we slowly ratchet it down, it actually can be losing power at each step. And so I think what separates, and so I'm by no means against incremental change. Everything I've ever worked on in my career is incremental. The thing that you have to keep your eye on is, does the person doing that have a theory for how that incremental change, as the snowball rolls down the mountain, is getting bigger and bigger, and it's going to turn into more radical change? Or is that person just going to be satisfied with incremental change? And that, I think, is the real tension, not the bipartisan nature of it, but the real tension is between people whose vision is basically abolishing all of these systems and people whose vision is slightly less cruel versions of the existing system. And I don't know how to answer your question in terms of local coalitions, other than to say the same dynamic is playing out in local coalitions all over the country.
We have time for 2 more questions, so I'll take yours here.
I'm Joe Shapiro. Thanks for the shout out before. I'm a journalist at NPR. So Alec, I want to hear more about how you envision this radical social movement that's going to create this change. And you know, you talked about marriage equality and the change over 20 years. It seems that happened because gay people started coming out. And you know, 20 years before, people didn't know a lot of didn't know a lot of other know people who were gay, and then suddenly, as people knew, they were in your family, there were people you worked with. So how do we get that kind of understanding in this movement. So how do you see that radical social movement spreading?
So let me just preface the answer by saying, I don't know that that question is really ultimately one for me to answer. So I think I certainly have a view, which I'll be happy to tell you. But that is a question, I think, for the people that are organizing the movement, and it shouldn't be like, a fancy lawyer in a pink sweater, in DC. By and large, I certainly have done a lot of work with people who have theories about this, and I think that's what's really informed like a lot of my perspective. But I think one of the mistakes is that we're always looking to people like me to say, well, what is it all going to look like, and what's our strategy going to be? And I think that is a real error that shouldn't be repeated. My own view is something like we need to be hearing from the people that are directly impacted. So I think there's been really like a couple of intellectual failures at the heart of mass human caging, and some moral failures. So intellectually, we've failed to, and as I argue in the book, we failed to appreciate the costs of the system of mass human caging. And that's because we haven't been listening to the voices of the people who are directly impacted by it. There was a lot of attention paid to the family separation crisis at the border over the last year and a half. But there are 3,160 local jails that are essentially places of family separation, forcibly, every single city and town in this country. We haven't understood those costs because we haven't made space in our cultural discourse for the voices of people who are, whose bodies and minds and families and communities are on the line. So one, we need to dramatically change who's being heard in media, in the arts, and so that's one reason why Civil Rights Corps has an artist and a poet in residence who are formerly incarcerated. We're trying to change the way our lawyers think internally, trying to change the way that we think and work and talk about all of these issues and the kinds of voices that are given privilege in these conversations. Number one, that's the first intellectual failure. A second intellectual failure is we haven't scrutinized the purported benefits of mass incarceration. And so there is a role for journalists and scientists and maybe lawyers and other people to actually demonstrate that for the public in a really persuasive way that what's actually going on is the use of a giant metastasized bureaucracy to control certain populations. It has zero, and in fact, significantly negative effects on the things that it tells you that its function is: public safety, well-being, right, equality. There is part of the intellectual failure is a failure to understand and scrutinize the purported benefits. Then I think there's a moral failure. All of us have allowed ourselves to be really complicit and have failed to approach the situation with the requisite level of urgency. So I was invited to the White House once, and only once, for reasons I think you can probably imagine. And we were at this event. Our purpose was, after like 7 years of the Obama administration, we were getting together and we were going to have a panel where we talked about the problems in the criminal legal system with fines, fees, and bail. It was a wonderful panel. Judge Morrison was speaking. A lot of other luminaries. I was not speaking, I was just sitting there. I did ask a couple of questions, which is the reason I'm not invited back. But one thing struck me. After 7 or 8 years of essentially doing nothing, doing mostly bad things in the criminal punishment bureaucracy, the administration decided that they were going to bring together all these experts and talk about how horrible it is that hundreds of thousands of people are detained every single day because they can't pay money bail, and that tens of millions of people are crushed under the weight of fines and fees. And 13 million people can't drive, can't take their kids to the hospital, can't go to work, just because they owe debt around that. And we were talking about these issues. And then in the middle of it, the Attorney General comes in and interrupts everything. Says, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I know you all must be freaking out. I know all of you are very worried about what's going on in San Bernardino. I want to assure you, we've got Tactical Team A and Tactical Team D and SWAT Team F, and they're all flying out there right now, and they're going to interview people, they're getting to the bottom of it, we're going to make people safe, and everyone's clapping." I thought to myself, that is what it looks like when someone treats something with urgency. That is what it looks like when someone responds to suffering in a way that has moral urgency. Not 7 years later having a discussion about if the problem is bad. It was almost like if you all are having hopefully a nice time at this book talk, Payne was amazing. You go home, you turn on the local news. It turns out that while I was here talking to you, the DC police had raided my house. And in my house, it had a dungeon. And in the dungeon, I was keeping people. I've been plucking them off the street, mostly black and brown people, almost all impoverished people. And I was torturing them. I was exposing them to sexual assault, physical abuse, squalor, starving them, putting them in solitary confinement in little corners of the basement. I think many of you would actually support the police raiding my home. Some of you might even support prosecuting me for that crime, like the guy in Cleveland a few years ago had the women in his dungeon. And I think a lot of you would support, nonetheless, some kind of emergency medical action to rescue all of those people. But that is the situation we have in over 3,000 local jails in this country. We've allowed our jails to become grotesque torture chambers. Before I got here, I was working on a case on the way here about a woman who's 8.5 months pregnant. She can't afford her money bail. The judge jailed her because he wanted her to have her baby in the jail because the jail was 10 minutes closer to the hospital than the treatment facility she wanted to live in with her unborn baby. And we can't get her out of jail. And she's gonna have her baby, just like the woman we couldn't get out 2 weeks ago in San Jose. She's gonna have her baby, and as soon as she has her baby, it's gonna be ripped from her. That is the situation. And I just found out today that woman is in solitary confinement in that jail. That's just what we're dealing with. And that's in Santa Clara County, which is supposedly the most progressive pretrial county in the state of California, one of the most progressive states in the country. And I say all of this not to, be a downer, but to acknowledge that we haven't treated these issues with the moral urgency that they deserve. So what will the movement require? It'll require leadership by the people whose bodies and minds are on the line to force our society in ways that I can't do just talking at you about things, to force you to confront and to look at what we're doing in a way that actually moves people to action. I don't know exactly what that'll look like, but I can tell you it looks a lot like the organizing that we're seeing on the ground in some of our cases by our organizing partners. The Close the Workhouse campaign in St. Louis, which is going to close that unspeakably cruel facility in St. Louis. It looks a lot like the New Jails organizing that was just recently done in New York City. It looks a lot like the Texas Organizing Project's work in Harris County, Texas. So there is that work being done. But I think one telling thing is that the work of more radical organizing has been divested from by philanthropy in our society. People are willing to give money to me because of maybe how I look and talk, and we're doing fancy legal cases. I think maybe more insidiously, it's because the work that we're doing isn't that much of a threat to the underlying order. We're trying to make it a threat, right? We're trying every day to do lawyering in a different way that's maybe more connected with communities than traditional lawyering, and we're trying and failing at that every single day and trying our best. But I think what's really telling is that the actual organizing in communities has been divested from. And I think that the ruling class, by and large, understands what's in its interest and what isn't in its interest to fund. And so they fund the things that maybe alleviate some of the worst symptoms of these problems, but don't strike at their core. And so what I hope is that there's a new generation of people working on these issues that actually understand the differences between those things. And that's really why I wrote the book, to try to move people to action around these sets of principles.
Mentioned you can do one more question. It's 8 o'clock now, but I can still do one more question, or we can move to the signing. Okay.
Hi, my name's John. I have a short question. So, you mentioned at the end.
Probably a long answer, but myself.
You mentioned at the end that these grassroots efforts have been divested. To what extent is money helpful in this movement, and where, as someone who's dealt a lot with the movement, does money help? I mean, where, if you have money to give, where would you put it?
Great question, John. So there are lots of organizations locally all over the country that need money to, so lots of organizations, for example, I'll just take one organization that we work with a lot, Silicon Valley Debug in San Jose. Debug was doing incredible organizing work. They invented this model called participatory defense, which essentially uses the criminal defense process as an on-ramp for families who have loved ones going through the criminal process to organize them and get them involved and engaged in the criminal system. And then those families then become the debug community, and they help the next family that comes in, right? And it politicizes and engages people. Much of that work was being done by volunteers. And there's so many organizations that are doing some of the most incredible work here, elsewhere, around the country, in every major city and every smaller town, that are doing it essentially with no resources. They can't produce materials. They can't pay the people that are working for them, and that's a real problem, because you need to be able to pay people to do this work, to have it be consistent and enduring. And so one of the reasons why the proceeds, the royalties from this book are being donated to a group called SE Justice Group in California, which is organizing women with incarcerated loved ones. So don't worry, none of your money will go to me if you end up buying the book tonight. But like, we can talk afterward. There's lots of organizations. I encourage you to actually do your own research wherever you live about what are the organizations that are actually organizing and building power in your community, and which of those organizations are led by people that have been directly impacted by the criminal punishment bureaucracy, and which of them have an actual theory of change that involves, at the end of the day, like abolishing these systems. And those are the organizations I would donate to. And there's a lot of great ones. We've been working with a number of organizations like that around the country. I'd be happy to offer you some thoughts about specific places. But there's also great ones in DC. And so I think I give some rules of thumb at the end of the first essay about the kinds of changes that are good. And so you want to, are these organizations advocating for those kinds of changes? And are they led by directly impacted people? Do they have radical politics that involves abolishing these systems? Those are the kinds of questions I would ask myself as I'm thinking about whether to donate to an organization. If an organization doesn't have radical politics and isn't seeking to abolish the system, I think you can be assured that it probably won't make much of an impact, and two, that someone else is probably with much more money than you is probably already giving them money. So I think, Jonathan, we're done. So I just wanted to say one more time, Payne the Poet is an amazing artist, and I've done a number of events with him, and he moves me to tears every single time. But he needs you to support him. He's got a Patreon that you can donate to, loves to do events, so find Payne if he's not already gone back on the bus, but I don't see Payne. But yeah, so I don't think he had to leave. But I just can't stress enough how incredible an artist he is and how difficult it is to make a living doing this work. So please consider supporting Payne's work. As I mentioned, please also take a moment to look up the SE Justice Group, which is the organization that all the royalties are going to. They're doing really amazing and inspiring work, and I couldn't be more proud to be associated with them. And I also wanted to thank Politics and Prose and Jonathan for putting on this event, and all of you for coming, and I'll just be here to sign books for the next 30 minutes or so.